Okay, so welcome to the second part of the Fundamentals of Music Theory program. This is number 2 if you joined us for the first one, which went over music notation. So we learned how to read and write sheet music and the basics and principles of that, and sort of our first foray into the whole that is music theory. So for this workshop today, what we're going to talk about we're going to talk about what scales are, what intervals are, what keys are, and this will build us up to what we'll do next week, which is talking about chords and chord progressions. So what we're doing over the course of these 4 workshops is we are creating these building blocks to be able to start composing music. So what's very important to that is talking about scales. Once you know the scales, that's going to help you with forming chords. So this specific lesson, we're going to talk about intervals first. Then we're going to talk about scales, so major and minor, and then we'll also talk about keys. Okay, so first with intervals. So this is a bit of a recap from last week, just in case there's anyone new joining us, but the names of the notes. So in music, and when we're talking about music, we're talking about sort of like Western music, so United States, America, Europe, different countries that have their own sort of subsect of music will have their own system, but this is a system that we're working with. And for this, for our purposes, music has 7 notes, and these are the letters A through G. Almost always we're going to start with C and then work our way back over to B. So you should be able to hear this, but let me know. So it's going from C all the way back to C.
Anna, I wasn't able to hear it on my end.
Okay. It should have been, let me try to stop share and share again.
I was able to hear it, but it was really faint.
Oh, okay. Okay, let me know how if it's any better. Okay. So that note that we started with is what you're seeing there on the screen. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So when we talk in terms of a piano, those 7 letters, those are always going to be the white keys. And we'll talk about just a second here about the black keys. And then this is the other thing to remember too, when we go up the piano, so going to the left, if you're facing it, those notes are going to be lower. So the difference between 2, right? And then as we go up to the right, those pitches get higher. So the difference between and. So let's talk about what are intervals. So intervals are the differences in pitch between the notes. So what we talked about in the last workshop is that pitch is the frequency. So every note, and any sound that you hear is going to have its own frequency. The differences between those pitches when we talk about music are called intervals. And intervals are referred to as semitones or tones. You might also hear half step or whole step. They mean the same thing. I usually refer to them as semitones. That's how I learned it, but it's not incorrect to call it a half step or a whole step. They mean the same thing, just in case you see it written one way or another. And so the 2 scales that we're going to talk about that use intervals, they're going to be diatonic scales. And diatonic scales means that they have 2 semitones and 5 whole tones, or 5 just tones. And that's per octave. And then the way we describe intervals, they're named by their quality and by their number. So the qualities are perfect, and perfect means that it's perfectly, like when we hear it, it sounds right. And when we play 2 notes that have the same name, so C and C, they're so in harmony that they don't even sound like 2 separate notes. Whenever they're kind of off, it's called dissonance. And that's how So as I was going down, comparing C to the other notes, we start hearing more of a difference, and sometimes we hear that sort of like discord type of sound. And those are the different intervals. That's how we describe those. So we have perfect, we have major and minor, augmented, and diminished. And when we talk about chords next week, we'll go into these more because you'll have diminished chords, augmented chords. But the difference between those are going to be about the differences between the intervals, the difference between how many semitones between C to E, C to G, and so forth. That's the difference between those qualities. And then also for the number. So if we remember that this thing here, both of these here are called the staff, and these are our symbols here that mean treble. So it tells us that this note starts on E, space F, and then so forth, all the way back up to C. And then for the bass, starting with G, so good boys do fine always. And here for treble, every good boy does fine, starting with E. So how we number those, we're going to count both the lines and the spaces. So if you can see here, we have unison or 1, which is perfect, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and then finally back to 8. What they're counting here is both the lines and the spaces. So even though for these two notes here, it doesn't really seem like they're that far away, you count the number you start on. So we're starting here on C, this space here, D, and then finally up to E. So then this would make this a third. So many questions on how we number intervals. If that's confusing, that we use the lines and the spaces to count them instead of using those separately. Okay. And this is something that's going to, oh, do I have a, okay. And this is something, like I said, we're going to get more into when we talk about chords. And if you're familiar with the song Hallelujah, the Leonard Cohen song, which has been covered by everyone, in that first verse, he talks about, it goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, and the major lift. He's literally referring to the chords that he's playing when he's playing that song. So the fourth is that fourth chord, the fourth chord of F major, which is what that scale is that he's playing. Then the fifth is going to go up to G major. The minor fall, so talking about a minor chord there, minor chord, and then major lift, major chord. So that's kind of something that you can think of to remember those terms. Fourth, fifth, major, minor. Unfortunately, he doesn't name all of them, which would be really helpful. Any questions on intervals before we move on? Okay. So next we're going to talk about sharps, flats, and naturals. And this is where we bring into the black keys. So I'm actually going to switch my camera. Hopefully they'll let me do that while I'm sharing. And if you're on a mobile device, I don't know if you can still see my camera. I don't know if this is only something that you'll be able to see at the same time if you're on a laptop computer or like a desktop. Is there anyone who can't see both the presentation and my camera?
I am okay on the iPad.
Okay, good. And so what I wanted to show here, I wanted to show you a lot closer. But so we talk about sharps, flats, and naturals. And this is going to, as far as naturals, is going to mainly refer to it on a piano, which is usually the easiest way to both teach and visualize music theory because of the way it's laid out. I brought my guitar and we will talk about sharps and flats on the guitar. It is just more visual on the piano. So when we talk about natural keys or natural notes, we're talking about all of the white keys. So all those, that's referred to as a natural. So it's neither sharp nor flat. The flats and the sharps are the black keys. Oops, sorry. I hit the natural by accident. So those are all the sharps and flats. Now on a piano and on a guitar as well, the sharps and flats, it's going to be relative to the scale or the key you're playing, whether or not it's considered a sharp or flat. So what happens on a piano and in other aspects of music is we have something that are called enharmonics. And enharmonics are where the depending on what your reference point is, so the scale or the key you're playing in, they sound the same pitch wise, but they can be spelled differently. So spelled is kind of how you refer to it as in music when you're thinking about writing sheet music. So if I were to play this key here, that could be C sharp or that could be D flat. That's going to depend on the key that I'm playing in as my reference point. So if I'm playing in the key of D flat, then obviously this is going to be D flat. This will not be C sharp. Looks like we have a question. Sorry. Enharmonic, yes. Yep. And enharmonics, they're really important when we talk about, and it's probably very hard to see. I should have made it a little bit bigger. But the keys B and C and E and F, as far as when they're laid out here on the piano, they look like natural keys, right? Because they're the white keys. But whenever we have a note, so take our center point as C, if we raise it and pitch one semitone, which will be an adjacent key, so C to B, that's raising it one semitone. That's a sharp. So B natural, another way to write it, or another name for B natural would be C flat. And flat is the little B symbol you see here there in the corner. It works the same way in the reverse. So when we want to make a note flat, we lower it by one semitone, so one note adjacent to it. So B to C can also be written as B to B flat. And so that's the process that works down the whole keyboard, but it is confusing when you have to refer to the natural keys. So if we start on C and we go up one, then we're going C flat. Then we go next, we have D, but going in the reverse, D back up to this key would be D sharp. Is that kind of confusing or does that kind of make sense? So going to the left, one semitone is going to be sharp. Going to the right, one semitone is going to be flat. And then for B and C and E and F, even though there's no black key in between them, that concept is still the same. That is the same as going just laid out a little bit differently. And we'll see on the next screen how that looks on the piano and for the guitar. So whenever you have notes that are right next to each other, whether that's a white key and a white key, as with E and F and B and C, or if it's with a white key and a black key, that is one semitone. So that's when they're right next to each other. So C to this one here, one semitone, E to F, one semitone, F to this key here, one semitone, and so on and so forth. For the guitar, it's the same thing. So if we start here, and hopefully this is not too far away, but I'm pressing down on this little white thing on here, this side is showing you all the frets and then all the notes that they represent. So if I start and I put my finger down on the second to the bottom, so like the second thinnest string on the first fret, that's a C. So if I go up one and I'm still pressing on the same string, but I'm now on the next fret, that would be C sharp or it'd be D flat, depending on my purposes. Then going to the next one, D. So if I were to do the C major scale, it would be on the piano. So C all the way back up to C. On a guitar, and then whole step, whole step. And then right here when I'm on, so if you're looking at the chart there, so the fifth fret is E. So instead of skipping over a whole fret, I'm actually going to go to the next fret to play F. Then I'll skip over a fret again to go to G, skip over a fret one more time to go to A, skip over a fret one more time. This is kind of where our chart cuts off, but that's B. And then remember semitone. So we're going to go back and then that's C. So C, C, all the way down to C. So on a guitar, it's less easy to see it the way that it's written out on a piano. But the concept is the same. So this fret being next to this fret, those notes are one semitone. But this fret, skipping one fret and going to the third one, that's going to be a tone or a whole step. So that's the same thing as going from, and going from, say, A to A sharp. It's the same things going over. So you're going to skip the same amount of frets as you would skip keys on a piano, if you want to think about it in that way. So was that, couldn't tell if I had any questions that popped up, anything that was confusing about the layout of the piano versus the guitar? Okay. So next we're going to get into the scales. So I've already played you the C major scale, which is just playing all of the white keys. But we're going to talk more onto how you figure out what those scales are. So first let's talk about what is a scale. So a scale is going to be a set of the musical notes ordered by pitch. So going from like ascending, so the low notes all the way to the high notes, they're going to be in order. So you're never going to go D, G, E, B, A, F. They're going to be in order by pitch. So this one to that one to that one, and so forth. And the scales are going to span a single octave. So if you're playing in a scale, you can play them in any octave, but they're only when we refer to the scale, it's only going to be one octave. So it'll always start and end with that same letter. So if you're going from a D sharp scale, going all the way through, you'll do the 7 notes, so D sharp all the way down when you go to C, but then you're going to start and end on that same note. So they just span one octave. And we have lots of different types of scales. We have major, minor, diatonic, which are what major and minor both are, chromatic, which would incorporate 12 notes instead of the 7 that we're going to talk about. There's also pentatonic, which will only include 5 notes. And those ones are more common in like folk music, jazz, like Caribbean music. A lot of like world music is going to incorporate a pentatonic scale. We're just going to talk about major and minor. And I believe I said this earlier, but a diatonic scale just means that it has 2 semitones and 5 tones. And we're going to see what that means. So first we'll talk about the major scale. So the major scale is the 8 consecutive notes. So for example, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then we go all the way back to C. And the major scale is always going to contain what are called tetrachords that are joined by a whole separate tone. And so what that looks like is this. And so hopefully you can see this on the piano. So if we play C to D, that's a whole tone, or just one tone or a whole step. D to E is also a whole step. And then when we go to E to F, that is a semitone. So that's that grouping there of those notes. So C to D, D to E, E to F. When we go into the next set, so the other set of the tetrachord, we're going to go from G to A to B, and then B back to C. So that's how, when you have the major scale, it's always going to be split up into those 2 groups. So the order goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So C to D, tone, D to E, tone, and then E to F is a semitone because there's no key separating them. Their keys are right next to each other. So E to F is that semitone, and then we're going to F to G, tone, because we have a black key separating them. G to A is a tone. A to B is a tone. And then B back to C is a semitone. And you'll know you'll play the scale right when there feels like there's some kind of resolution. So it sounds finished. It sounds complete. And so when we remember that pattern, the tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, that is the formula for every single scale. So any major scale is going to have that formula. So going to the next slide. So forming the major scale. So all the scales are going to have a tonic, which is going to be that very first note. And that is what the scale is going to be named after. So if we were to start on the, let's say we did the F major scale here, where we would go tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So F to G is a tone, G to A is a tone, but now we need to go one semitone. So we need to go A to, sorry, my one pick, A to A sharp. And then from A sharp, we need to go a tone. So we would go to C. And then we need to go another tone, C to D. One more tone, D to E. And then finally, we finish with a semitone. And then we have E to F. So you can pick any note to start on. And that's the pattern that you'll do. And that's the whole scale. So tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. The C major scale is obviously the easiest one to look at and visualize because you're not having to worry about the black keys, but the concept applies to all of the scales. So for memorizing that C major scale kind of helps you know, okay, well, when I go to C to D, I have a black key between me. D to E, black key. E to F, nothing there. F to G, black key. G to A, black key. A to B, black key. B to C, no black key. So tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. If you say it over and over again, it usually will kind of stick. But the C major scale is that great example of being able to see exactly how it's laid out without having to memorize where the black keys come into play. And the other thing to remember is that when we're doing the, when you're playing the scales, the way you name the notes is important. So there can only be one note name per scale. So you can't have C and C sharp. If you do need to go from this key to that one, you'll have to refer to this as D flat. So you can only have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So if any of those need to be sharp or flat, then it will have to it'll have to replace another name. So you can't do C, C flat, D, D sharp. It has to be one or the other. So if you do have to go like we do in F major, we go from A to this key here. We have to refer to this as B flat, not A sharp. And the pitch is the same. So remember, they're in harmonics. So regardless of what you call it, the pitch is the same, but there is a right and a wrong way to spell it out when you're writing on sheet music or when you're just referring to the scale. So let's talk about the minor scale. So unlike the major scale, the term minor scale actually refers to more than one minor scale. Most likely when someone is saying like, oh, I've written a piece in the minor scale or something like that, or the minor key, they're referring to the natural minor scale. But there's also the harmonic minor scale, which is almost the exact same as the natural minor scale. The only difference is that the seventh scale degree, which means the seventh note, is going to be raised a half step. So A minor has the exact same concept as a C major scale. It has no black keys, so it would be if you were to play that in the harmonic scale, then you would play a G sharp instead of a G. So the only difference would be would go to and that's the harmonic minor scale. So very easy to play, very similar. And you can, if you compose something in the natural minor scale and you played the harmonic scale over it, so use those notes instead, that would be that would sound fine. It's almost the exact same notes. You can do that. Oh, okay. So the difference between the two minor scales. So the natural minor scale is the same concept where we've been talking about of the oh, I haven't given you guys that yet, but how I said like with the major scale where it's tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. The minor scale has that same concept when we talk about the natural minor scale. The only difference between the natural minor scale and the harmonic minor scale is that the seventh note in the scale is always going to be raised a half step or a semitone. So in the case of A minor, the G becomes G sharp, but everything else is the same. So that would work for any other any scale. So if it was a D in the natural minor scale, it would just become a D sharp, and it's always raised a minor or raised a semitone. So if it was originally B sharp, then it would become C flat, or I'm sorry, C sharp. It would just go up one. Does that make sense? So it's always going to go up. It's never going to go in the reverse. It'll always be raised one semitone. Okay. But for our purposes, since we're only doing like a fundamental, so we're just kind of going through the basics and sort of simplifying music theory, we're only going to refer to, when we talk about minor scale, we are just going to be referring to the natural minor scale. And the harmonic minor scale, it is frequently used, but most often like in something like jazz. So how do we form the minor scale? So the minor scale is going to be tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. So remembering that because it's a diatonic scale, just like the major scale, it's going to have 5 tones and 2 semitones. The order is just different than it is in the major scale. So again, referring to the A minor scale, which uses only the white keys, it goes A to B, tone, black key between them, B to C, semitone, no black key between them, C to D, which is a tone, black key, D to E, black key between them, E to F, which is a semitone, no black key, and then F to G, which is a tone, black key between them, and then back to A, G to A, tone between them. And so that's how you would form all the scales. So the minor scale, or for the natural minor scale, it's always going to be tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. And for every major scale, or for every minor scale, it has a relative major scale and vice versa. And we'll see a big like diagram of what that looks like in a slide or two. But how, if you just want to kind of figure out on your own what the minor scale is of a major scale, it's always going to be the 6th degree, which means the 6th note of its relative major. So C major is the relative major of A minor. So if we look at C and we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we get A. So A is its relative minor. And that goes for all of them. It's like when we were looking at G, or I'm sorry, at F. So D is its relative minor because D was the 6th note. So that goes for, yeah, so really any of them. So if you were to do G major, you'd have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and then back to G. So then that sixth degree would be E. So E is the relative minor. And whenever you have the relative minor, it's going to have the exact same amount of sharps or flats as its relative major. But again, we'll see a big diagram of what that looks like. But that's the reason why A minor and C major both only use the white keys. They have the exact same notes in their scale, being relative major and minors. So here's again some things to remember about scales. So sharps or flats, but not both. So when you use sharps and flats together, that can be confusing, especially again when you're looking at a piano and you have these enharmonic keys where this key is also this key, they represent the same note. Just use sharps or flats. So if you wanted to go through yourself and figure out, okay, let me start on E and figure out what the major scale for E is, start with E and figure out what the minor scale is. If you're going to write it out, it needs to be just sharps or flats. So you don't want to use them both together. And when you write out sharps or flats, especially on sheet music, they're referred to as accidentals. That like note, the little like pound symbol and then the lowercase b, those are referred to as accidentals. And when you have a relative major minor scale, try to use the one that has the least amount of sharps or flats because it'll just make it easier on yourself. When we see the big kind of diagram that shows like this one has 7 sharps, this one has 5 flats, use the one that's going to have the least amount because it can almost be redundant. If you're using all of the black keys, that's kind of kind of a lot to do when you're playing. But if you can reduce those amounts by just using a relative scale, that's going to help you out, especially as you're learning how to play these instruments and learning how to compose. And then again, remember that you can only have one letter per scale. So you can't go C sharp, it needs to be D flat, and so on. And that's just so that way only one letter is represented, A through G. So only one of each 7 notes. And then, yeah, so the ease of playing a scale is going to be based on the instrument. So playing the C major scale on the piano, very, very simple. We just press all the white keys. But as you can see on the guitar, while it's not rocket science, it's not exactly as simple as playing it on here. So if there's an instrument that you are have like an easier time playing versus another one, or a scale is easier or a chord is easier, try to use that to influence what scale you're going to play. Because as we're about to see, it's like a little spoiler, the key you're playing in is directly based on the scale you're playing. So a scale that has a ton of sharps or a ton of flats is going to be possibly harder for you to play depending on the instrument you're playing in. Chord progressions may be easier depending on the instrument you're playing in, and all of that is going to be a factor in what scale you decide to write your music based on. And so we've kind of just been looking at guitars and pianos because those are very common instruments that people get into when they're starting to play music, especially if you don't plan on being accompanied by other instruments, you want to play just by yourself. Those are really easy instruments to compose a whole song on and be done. But if you're ever going to write music for other people or for other people to play along with you, you can also take into consideration what those instruments are going to be. So string instruments like violins or cellos, those ones, the keys that have sharps are sometimes easier for those instruments to play because of the way that they're made. So when they press down on like those strings, the note's automatically going to be sharpened. So it's easier for them to play a scale that's full of sharps. Well, again, you still don't want to have 10 sharps, which that's not really possible, but you don't have a ton of sharps in the scale that you're playing in. If you're going between, okay, well, I could play this scale or this scale, it depends on what you're composing it for. Wind players, so like things like flutes or clarinets, those instruments are kind of built more towards playing flat keys or playing in flat keys. So it's really just going to depend on the instrument and the intention behind your composition. So lastly, we're going to talk about keys. So as I was saying before, the key of the musical composition, it's just telling you what scale you're playing in. So if I'm playing in the key of C, that's implying that I'm playing the key of C major. Usually if it's going to be played at a minor scale, that is specified. If you don't see a specification there, it usually means it's major. And you could always ask for clarification if you receive sheet music from someone, but if it says it's being played in the key of C, it's most likely going to be played C major rather than C minor. And all of the notes that you're able to play in that key are going to be the notes that you're playing in the scale. So this shows all of the key signatures. So if you remember from last week, whenever we start here with our treble clef or our bass clef, the symbol that immediately follows it is going to be this key signature. So if you see no key signature on the bass or the treble clef, that means it's in C major or A minor. And so this is just showing you increasingly based on how many sharps or flats. So yeah, so maybe don't make it hard on yourself and write in the key of F sharp major if that's going to be a little too difficult to write in. And the reason why, if you're looking here, and we kind of just briefly recapped over that, but these lines and spaces are lettered differently for the treble and bass. So that's what's just showing you the difference here. That's why sometimes they're looking a little lower or higher. It's because the treble clef is higher than the bass clef. And so since these have the exact same key signature, you might be like, well, how do I figure out if it's A major or F sharp minor if it doesn't specify? You'll want to look at the notes and the chords and the melodies that they're playing. So if you remember when we were playing in the scale of C, so there's a resolution. We go from C to C and it brings it like back home. So we know where we started, that first tone that we hear. And when it's over and we go back to that C, it sounds complete. It kind of wraps up nicely. Well, when you're looking at the notes that are played, because you'll be so good at it, you'll be able to just look at the notes that are on there and know exactly what the letters are, or the notes that it's playing. If you're seeing a chord progression where it kind of starts with a C major chord and then it goes to this chord and that and goes back to a C, well, that'll kind of give you that idea that this is probably in C major, because an A minor is going to make sure that A is kind of the star of the show, that A is that home note, that resolution, that finish. So even though they A minor and C major and D flat major and B flat major have the exact same sharps and flats, the order of those chords, those chord progressions, they're going to be different. They're the same exact notes, but that order is different. So that's how you'll be able to tell the difference. And so this is the last thing that I wanted to look at here. So this is the circle of fifths. And this big diagram with a lot of information on it is actually really helpful, and it's something that's really good to for you to refer to when you're first of all trying to keep track of these relative major and minor keys and scales and all of the different key signatures. So what this is showing you here, let me see if I can get like a little laser pointer thing. Okay. So everything in music kind of is based around this C. And then it's relative minor, A minor here. So for the circle of fifths, so the reason why it's referred to that is because it's for every fifth note, that's where we're going up. So when we start on C, and we start with C, so if we run piano, C, 1, 2 D, 3 E, 4 F, 5 G. So the fifth note or the fifth scale degree in the C major scale is going to be G. So in the circle of fifths, we start with C and we go up 1 to G. And this one, look at that. The first one there, it has 1 sharp. Same thing happens when we go in the reverse, right? So we go from C, 1, and go reverse, B, A, G, F. Where does that leave us? We go back 1 to F, and those are the flats. So it's showing you here. So going up 5, we get a sharp and we get G. When we go back 5, we get a flat and we land on F. And so then it starts over. So then you start with G, and let's go 5 from G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And look where we are there. We're on D. And now D has 2 sharps. And so that's how it's going to go. So we go back the other way, we end up on B flat. So we're just going to keep going up and back based on these scales. So that's how you get the get all these letters going around, and that's why they're not in orders. That's why it's not C, D, E, F, G. It's based on the 5th scale degree for that specific note. And then if you remember that the relative minor is based on the 6th degree. And so this is what this is showing here. Now, if we were to go from A minor, the same thing happens. So going A, 2, 3, 4, 5, we land on E. So E minor is next. So A minor to E minor, that's the 5th. So starting with A to E, that's the 5th degree. So that's next. And E minor also has 1 sharp. So that's what this chart is showing you going around. And it's also showing you what those key signatures are going to look like. So it's going to go order from 0 sharps or flats to 1 sharp, 2 sharps, 3 sharps, 4 sharps, 5 sharps, 6 sharps, and then back over here to 7 sharps. And in the reverse, 1 flat, 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats, 5 flats, 6 flats, and 7 flats. And this is what I was talking about before, where it's like, if you have this many flats, I mean, that's practically where it's just every single note that you're playing is a flat, or every single note you're playing is a sharp. That's almost impractical depending on the instrument you're playing. So that should give you some influence when you're deciding which scale to play in. So if you really, really want to play, these specific notes that you want to play in C sharp, well, maybe play in D flat, because it's going to sound the same to whoever's listening to it, but it has way less accidentals than you do if you're playing in C sharp. It's not practical. So that's kind of the beauty of those enharmonic equivalents. So remember the ones where they sound the same, but they're written differently. These 5 flats playing against these 7 sharps, they're going to sound the same. If you weren't looking at this piano and I played those back to back, you're just not going to hear some huge life-shattering difference. So if for whatever reason you really want to play or compose a piece that's in one of these, just outrageously amount of sharps or flats, try to get the enharmonic equivalent. Try to choose that one instead, because they'll just make it easier on yourself. And then the other thing too is that you might have noticed that not every single sharp or flat or kind of note is represented on here. These are all of the keys that have key signatures. Technically, every scale you can play is going to have a key. The key exists. We're talking about music theory, right? So in theory, that key does exist, but it would have so many sharps or flats, or in some cases like double sharps and double flats, that it would be almost unreadable if you were reading it in sheet music. It would not work. So those are called theoretical keys, and you will. I'll even go as far as to say you'll never see something composed in those keys, especially when they have equivalents. So something like G sharp major would have like 7 sharps. And so you just wouldn't do that. You would just use A flat major instead, because look, it only has 4 flats and it's going to sound the same. That's what it comes down to, is that as long as it's going to sound the same, you can still play it. So G sharp is technically represented here in the circle of fifths, but it's labeled here as A flat because that is just way more practical to play. So while they exist in theory, you would not use those, and they don't have key signatures. So if you want to be really uh like you like a challenge and you do want to try to play in one of those keys, you can figure out those keys the same way, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. You can figure it out those ways, but there is no key signature. There's no key signature. And I wouldn't even really know how to write a key signature that looks like that. It doesn't exist. These are the key signatures that exist. So for all of these that you see here, so B flat minor, A sharp minor, D flat, C sharp, these are those key signatures. So the flat ones are obviously this here, the 5 flats, and then the sharps are down here with the 7 sharps. But anything that you do not see on the circle of fifths does not have a key signature that exists. And it would be impractical if you really did want to play something in that, and you just probably would not or should not. And then lastly, we'll talk about how we would use keys. So especially when we start talking about like, oh, well, this key sounds exactly like this key. So it's like, what's the difference? What's the point of using different keys? Why can't I C major scale so easy to play? Well, why don't I just write every single song ever in the key of C major? You could. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. That would be absolutely your choice. If you're composing a whole album, 12, 15 songs, and every single song uses the exact same notes, the exact same chord progressions, the melodies are going to sound the same as well, right? If you're singing over it, it's going to sound the same, or it's going to sound at least very similar. It'll be kind of boring. No one really wants to listen to 15 songs that sound the exact same. So mixing up those different keys that you're playing in, they give you that. C major doesn't have those sharps and flats that you get from the other keys, and that can make it more dynamic. You listen to this one and it sounds maybe a little bit brighter. Major keys tend to be referred to as like a brighter key, while minor keys are usually referred to as darker, or maybe like sadder. But that's also up to who's listening to it, how you write the song. You could write a really sad song using, quote unquote, happy or upbeat chords or keys. So you don't have to live by that rule that if you're playing a minor key, you have to write some super depressing song, or if you're playing in a major key, it has to be a happy, peppy song. That's not a hard and fast rule. That's usually how those different keys are described. When you want to simply put, well, what's the difference? Minor, usually darker, major, usually a little bit brighter. And you don't have to be someone who uses both major or minor. You could. There are a lot of artists that just use the major key. I want to say it was Taylor Swift, who she had an entire album. So her whole album, again, 12, 15 songs, only used major keys. They were different keys, C here, D or whatever, but she did not use any minor keys in her whole album. The Beatles, they're also another one that most of their songs are in a major key. Now they do have some that are in the minor, but I want to say it's like 80, 90% of their songs are written in a major key. Does that mean that it's the best key? Not necessarily, but that's just what they chose to use. So you can do that. If you just want to play in the major key, maybe if that's easier, if that's where you kind of find, maybe that's what your sound is. Your sound is something that has a lot of major like chords, you like playing those, then you're more than welcome to only use major keys, or you could use a mixture of them. Music, it's objective. So it's all about what sounds good to you, and you're the artist, you're the composer. It's going to be up to you how you'd like it to sound. So there's no hard and fast rule on when to use certain keys, how to use certain keys, and in what way, how many per project. That's going to be up to what you want it to sound like. And then wanted to end here with just talking about what we're going to talk about in the next workshop. I believe it's full, it might be waitlisted, but I know I saw that most of the people who were on the list for tonight's program were also on the list for next week's, which will be the third one, where we're going to talk about chords, chord progressions, and we'll also talk about harmony. So we'll again use the piano and the guitar for those examples. but we'll talk about when you're, playing like as a C major. So that's a chord progression. So I'm playing one or two or more notes at the same time, and there's a rhyme or reason. So what I just played was a chord progression in the key of C major. And the reason why that's C major, not A minor, I started on C major, and when it resolved, it came back around to C major again. So we're going to talk about what that means, how you can figure out what those notes are, and what they look like on both the guitar and the piano. And then, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can reply to the email that I sent with the link to this program, or you could call. That's the number for Central Library, which has one of our creative experiences, or you can call Bar Library, which is where I am most of the time. And also, I'm asked about the recordings. So these will be uploaded to YouTube. That hasn't been done just yet. But you're also more than welcome to, if you would like me to email you these slides, I'm more than happy to email these to anyone who would like a copy. Especially to be able to like, you want to print out the circle of fifths, or if you want to refer to that information, yeah, feel free to email me and I can send you this slide. I can send you the one that we did previously. And then any future ones, I can also send those too. And then the recordings will be up on YouTube for where I kind of explain more in depth and give the examples on the piano and guitar. But this will have that sort of like basic information on it. I'm gonna stop share. Cool. Thank you everyone for joining this week. Great to see so many of you back from last week. And yeah, can't wait to get more into these building blocks of music composition next week and start talking about chords. That's when it gets really exciting and where we start really building songs. I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of songs that you can start playing if you have like a little keyboard at home, or if you want to come in here. This piano does live here at Bar, and there is one at Central as well. You can call that same number on the slide to make reservations to use the recording room, and you can come in here and practice, come in here and apply these sort of skills that we're building here. And next week, yeah, we're going to start talking about playing these songs. And while these workshops are not piano classes or guitar classes, everything that we're talking about are concepts that will help you get started in playing an instrument if you don't, or will help you figure out what to do with an instrument if you do have it and you're not really sure how to play it. So if you knew how to play a chord on the guitar, but you didn't really know what you're doing, next week we're going to explain, okay, when you're playing the guitar, you're holding down this note, and this note, and when you strum, you're playing these notes, and that's how you're creating a chord. So that's what we'll break down next week. And then the following week, the fourth one, which will be 2 weeks from today, that one is going to go into kind of putting this all together, and we'll talk about how to get started composing and then all the resources we have here. And I'll show you all the different software that you can use both at home and in the space to be able to start composing. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask. But if not, I will see everyone next week. And next week, don't forget it's on a Thursday, not a Wednesday like the other ones have been. That's the only difference. We had, yeah, just a little scheduling issue. So it'll be next Thursday. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.